Today we're talking about why trucking companies can be held accountable for accidents caused by their drivers. It's important to know that in a trucking accident case, not only can the driver be held accountable like in a car accident, but there could be also claims made against the trucking company itself for those accidents. One reason why the trucking companies could be held responsible for the negligence or the conduct of their employee truck driver is a doctrine generally referred to as Respondeat Superior. Some people describe it as Vicarious Liability in some contexts. Essentially, what it means is that an employer can be held responsible for the actions of their employee that are taken within the scope of their work. So if the employer has an employee that has a certain function and within the scope of their work they do that function inappropriately or negligently, not only can the worker be held responsible, but also the employer for the conduct of their employee. And this is an important concept in law because it allows the victims to seek compensation from the trucking company, and often the trucking company is in a much better position to pay the claim. They've got more assets, more insurance, generally more likely to be able to pay a significant claim as opposed to the driver alone. Another reason why trucking companies can be held accountable for the conduct of their driver is because of things that the trucking company did itself. Trucks aren't like regular passenger vehicles. They're larger, they're heavier, they're more difficult to drive. That's why there's additional requirements with licensing and training and experience and just generally regulation. Trucks are heavily regulated in terms of the hours they can operate, the weights they can carry. That's all for the public safety because there's a recognition that trucks are more dangerous. The trucking company, because of that, has an obligation. They have obligations to adequately train their drivers, supervise their drivers, make sure their drivers are operating under the regulations and guidelines, both federal and state. So if a trucking company fails to uphold their duties and obligations, they are putting the public at risk. And so the law recognizes that a victim can advance a claim against the trucking company for its negligence or failures in ensuring that their truck and their driver are operating their vehicle safely. Another common reason why trucking companies can be held accountable is for negligence in their hiring practices and failure to do background checks on their drivers. There are specific detailed records on commercial truck drivers, and so the trucking company has an obligation to review those records and make sure the driver is safe. Also, are they calling other employers? Are they finding out whether or not this driver had a safe driving record, whether or not they were fired from other jobs for unsafe operation? Sometimes in truck accident cases, particularly serious truck accident cases, when we start to look at the hiring practices and we start to really investigate and go through the discovery process and get the records and interview or depose the people at the truck company, we find out that even though they had these procedures in place, we end up finding out that they didn't actually do them, or they just did the bare minimum. They didn't make the calls. Had they called, they would have found out that this driver had a history of poor performance, of being negligent. And so that's enough oftentimes to show the trucking company was negligent and that they didn't do the things they should have done in order to make sure that all of the vehicles, all of these large trucks that they put on the road are being operated as safely as possible for the public. Sometimes truck drivers and the trucking industry in general is pressured to meet deadlines in terms of delivery. That can cause drivers to either push the limits, drive excessively over the speed limit, drive when they shouldn't be driving, not rest as frequently as they should. Trucks, drivers, trucking companies, the whole trucking industry is a regulated industry. There are safety standards in place both at the federal level and at the state level. Truck drivers and trucking companies are required to follow those regulations. It's important to look at that and have an experienced trucking lawyer to look at that and determine whether or not the trucking company and their employees have actually followed the regulations. And where they haven't, which is often the case in truck accidents, the trucking company will be held responsible. Sometimes in extreme situations, there may even be evidence that the trucking company itself maybe was encouraging their drivers or turning a blind eye to the fact that the drivers were violating regulations, particularly with respect to the hours of operation, the hours of service of that truck and that driver. Sometimes it's so egregious that it could rise to the level of punitive damages. And punitive damages are designed to go beyond compensating the victim for the harm or loss and actually punishing the at-fault party to discourage that sort of conduct in the future. Sometimes truck accidents are caused not by only driver error, but because of failures with the mechanics of the truck itself. Tires falling off, steering issues, brakes failing. So if a trucking company is not adequately maintaining their vehicle and that results in an accident, then again, that's a situation where the trucking company can be held responsible. Another reason why the trucking company may be responsible for the conduct of their driver is simply because of ownership of the vehicle. Generally, in motor vehicle accidents, the owners share in the responsibility and can be held liable for the conduct of the driver of that vehicle. We would look to the ownership of the vehicle, try to determine who owns it, and establish liability by way of ownership. Trucking companies are often held accountable because they have significant control over their drivers and the vehicles. Because of this responsibility, it's imperative that the trucking companies prioritize safety and prioritize following the regulations in order to protect the public. And when they fail to do that, injury lawyers, they'll sue the trucking company and hold them accountable because they're in such a position of control and responsibility, and they have every opportunity, frankly, to help keep the road safer for operators of smaller vehicles. Hope you enjoyed learning about this topic on trucking accidents. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us. We offer free consultations. We can be reached 24 hours a day, 7 days a week at our toll-free number or by visiting our website and completing a contact form there.